Hi, everyone. This is Professor Hall, and today we are talking about memoir. We're going to talk about what that means as a genre, some of the common themes, and why people should read memoirs, what they can get out of them. So let's get started. First, a lot of people confuse memoir with an autobiography, so I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the differences between those two things. A biography, bio means life, graph means right, so putting those root words together. Biography is a story of someone's life, and a regular biography is written by someone other than the subject. So, for example, if I were to write a book about George Washington, that would be a biography. An autobiography is a life story written by the person themselves. So, for example, this week you will have a few little segments and things to, there we go, a few excerpts to read, one of which will be from Helen Keller's autobiography. It's her story, and she is writing it about herself. Really, there are a couple key differences between autobiography and memoir. The first is that an autobiography really is meant to be a full life story. So it's meant to kind of tell about the person's entire life. A memoir, in contrast, is really meant to be more of like a snapshot as opposed to a movie, if you can think of it in those terms. A movie would show you the entire story. A snapshot would just show you like one piece of a story. So many memoirs have a specific focus of a couple of years or a couple of months or one particular incident. Sometimes they will have a few chapters before the major incident to kind of show you why that occurred and how they found themselves in that circumstance, and sometimes some chapters after, but the bulk of the story is going to be about that particular moment in time. The second feature of memoirs, as I have here in my list, are the aspects of creative nonfiction. So years ago, a lot of nonfiction was very dry and looked quite a bit different from fiction. So meaning that it didn't have those elements of those elements that fiction uses, those literary elements or literary devices. So things like symbolism and theme, dialogue very often, that was all kind of absent. But creative nonfiction takes the elements of fiction and basically it attempts to tell the truth, but in a creative way. Sometimes so that the story comes alive for readers, and sometimes so that it makes it more interesting for readers, and sometimes both. So essentially what you have with creative nonfiction are things like articles and essays and books, including memoirs, that almost read as if they are fiction. And a couple of times I've taught one of these books that we're doing this term in a different course, and people have said, wait, this is true? And I'm like, yes, this is true. It's a memoir. It's like an autobiography. It's the person writing about their own experiences and their own journey. And sometimes people find it hard to believe that it's true because of the way that it's written. So the aspects of these books that we're going to be talking about is much like you would find in another literature course. We're going to look at character development and the plot structure and common themes and all of those types of things, because the stories that we're reading are told in a way that makes them pieces of literature, and they're not just saying, this is what happened at point A, this is what happened at point B, this is what happened at point C, in kind of a dry way. Now, the examples that I'm giving you the first week, I hope that you can see some of the linguistic differences, some of the stylistic differences, some of the thematic differences, all of that, because you can really kind of tell, I think, the difference between some of the earlier works and some of the later works. A lot of, I switched my outline here. Yeah, so truth versus fiction. Sometimes, let me go back and highlight that because we've done it. There we go. Sometimes in these books, there are some very lightly fictionalized elements, meaning that an author might be talking about, we have a book where the book starts where the author is 6 or 7 years old, and then the bulk of the story takes place when she's 14 to 16. So recreating some of the exact scenes that happened when she was 6 or 7, she probably can't exactly remember what was said in a conversation, but she remembers the incident, she remembers what happened, and so maybe a few of the things that were said or the nature of what was said. For example, if you, I know someone whose parents were divorced around that age, when they were around that age. So if they tell you about what happened when their parents told them that they were getting divorced, they would get the gist of that conversation. My parents came to me and my brother, they sat us down, they said my dad wasn't going to live with us anymore, that kind of thing. But they might not get everything word for word. So there are sometimes a little bit of kind of fictional elements being used, particularly with the dialogue. Not as much for the most part with the structure of the story, although we do have one of our books is kind of told in a little bit non-linear format. What I mean by that is that these are not books where, like, the person is not making up the fact that their parents got a divorce, right? That would be an example, I guess. They might fill in the gaps of what the dialogue sounded like or looked like, maybe what people were wearing at the time, or that kind of thing, but they're not making up those incidents. So that's really an important thing to kind of note. They are really as close as they can trying to recreate and share their truth with you. So this is another thing that I think is going to be important, of kind of trying to respect what these women have experienced and what they've gone through, and the fact that this is their version of events as they kind of see them. We have one book in particular where the author's family has tried to discredit her, and we will talk about that when we get to that particular memoir. But even with that book, I would say it's pretty clear that they just saw things differently, and they saw her life differently, and they're not going to be happy about being depicted as, for example, being neglectful or uncaring at various points. So why memoirs by women? Well, I have some quotes, and I think this kind of sums up. I had the choice. I could have just picked all memoirs. Part of the reason that I didn't is because I wanted a little bit more of a narrow focus. So we have books that are written by women, and many of them were published in the time that memoir was becoming really quite a bit more popular. And there are, I think, a number of reasons for that I'll talk about in a minute. But I have this, I'll go down here. So this is from Helen Buss, Repossessing the World, Reading Memoirs by Contemporary Women, which was published in 2002. There are proliferation of memoirs that come out in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and I think part of the reason for that is that we are kind of past the second wave of feminism. The first wave of feminism, I'll mention this in some of my other lectures. The first wave of feminism is the lead up in the late 1800s, early 1900s to women earning the right to vote, or being granted the right to vote. The second wave of feminism takes place in the 1960s and 70s, and there you have people arguing for the right to equal pay, women's rights, more educational opportunities, more job opportunities, those kinds of things. So by the time the 1990s come, I think that many women who went through those experiences are now a little bit older, and they're kind of looking back and writing about them. And several of our books take place during that time period. So there's going to be quite a number of similarities. You also have more women working, more women publishing. So there are a number of kind of cultural and historical reasons for this. But at any rate, here's what Helen M. Bust has to say. Memoirs are not only representations of women's personal lives, but also they're the desire to repossess important parts of our culture in which women's stories have not mattered. In writing memoirs, these women assert that their lives have mattered. They reshape the memoir into a social discourse that blends the personal with the political, the self with the significant other, literature with history, and fiction with autobiography and essay. So I really love these two quotes from Dr. Buss here, because I think that she kind of hits on why I decided to focus this class on women's memoirs in particular. These are voices that have kind of been suppressed to a certain extent, and I also chose things that were not by famous women quite deliberately. And they might have become famous after they wrote the book. We are reading one by Maya Angelou, and certainly she was a famous figure, but really in part because of her writing. Similarly, some of the other women as well that we're reading have come into prominence after their books were published, right? And they're kind of known for their memoirs, and then later on for some of their other writing. But what I didn't want to pick a celebrity memoir, of which there are many, by famous people in Hollywood or in business or what have you, because I think that the assumption is that if you're a celebrity, your voice does matter and your story does matter. So instead, what I tried to pick were stories by women who had if you met them on the street, they would seem very ordinary, but they really had kind of extraordinary lives, and they've overcome obstacles and triumphed over adversity, which are some of the themes we'll talk about in a moment. But they really are trying to tell you their story, to reframe it, to understand it a little bit better, and to kind of reshape history, to say this was my part in history during this particular period of time, and this is what my life looked like. So it's a very interesting way, I think, of taking these historical moments that we kind of hear about in history class or when we're younger in social studies, and having a much more personal look at those historical events. So we do not, this term have, we do have this term, a book, Reading Lolita in Tehran, which takes place during the revolution in Iran. And so that is a huge historical, political moment, but we just see it told through the eyes of one woman and her experiences, and how the war affected her, how the revolution affected her, how she responded to those events, right? And in that way, that's what this author means by having this social discourse of blending the political with the personal, literature and history, fiction with these traditions of the autobiography and the essay. We're going to see other people. I mentioned Maya Angelou. She talks about her life just prior to really the buildup of the civil rights movement. We're going to see another individual who talks about her role in the 1960s during the hippie movement in California in the Haight-Ashbury district, and what happened to her during that time, and how she was able to overcome some of those life circumstances. We have another book by food travel writer Ruth Reichel, where she basically talks about her experiences with food and with travel during the 1970s. So these types of stories, I think, are quite interesting because they are, again, as this says, repossessing important parts of the culture and showing women's role in them, when really, prior to this point, a lot of history has been written by men. And then she also says, readers can use their reading experience to help themselves understand and write the significance of their own lives. So that's one of the things that I'm hoping that you get out of this class, where whether you are a male or female or non-binary, that you can read these people's stories and take something out of them and appreciate them for what they are, and kind of see yourself in some of the things that they went through, whether that has to do with some of their family and life circumstances, their pursuit of education, or their pursuit of success, or their pursuit of just understanding themselves and coming to a place where they know themselves better and they have a better sense of self. That's one of the things that I'm hoping for. So let's go back up. So one of the things in these stories, as we talk about some of the fictional elements, character-driven stories versus plot-driven stories. So many times, I think for this class, we're kind of going to have a little bit of both, but for the most part, memoirs are more character-driven than they are plot-driven. What does that mean? Well, that means that a plot-driven story is really driven by the action of the story. So an example I would say would be, a fictional example would be the movie Jurassic Park. Not the horrible sequels, but the original movie. Well, I guess the sequels too. Either way. That story is driven by the idea that dinosaurs have been recreated from DNA, and now they're on the loose and they're chasing people and they're going to hunt you down and kill you, right? You could put, as we've seen with so many of the sequels, you can put just about anybody in that story and show how they react, but essentially the story is being driven by the dinosaurs, right? That's plot driven. That's a plot driven story. So many traditional nonfiction books that are not as creative nonfiction are kind of plot-driven stories. We have, I mentioned the Iranian Revolution, right? Or the hippie movement of the 1960s. Those historical events would drive forward the plot. So in Iran, this political leader did this political leader did this is what happened to the country. And they might say, like, here's what happened in this region and here's what happened in this region. But the action is driving forward the story. In memoirs, because they're taking these larger events and making them personal, you have really a character-driven story instead of a plot-driven story. So what's pulling you along is the emotional journey of the person telling their story and telling you what's happened. Sometimes other characters are involved as well, but for the most part, it's the voice of the woman who is writing the memoir, who is telling you, here's what happened, but here's how I felt. Here's how I reacted. Here is what I ended up doing in light of these circumstances. So you're really following each narrator and the protagonist of the story, the main character, is the woman herself, and you're following her through all of these events, and you're watching how she learns and how she grows and how she falls into difficult situations, how she brings herself out of those, all of that kind of thing. So that's something that I'd like you to kind of be aware of and watch for. Having said that, the common plot structures that we have are therefore a little bit, no, there we go. The common plot structures that we have are therefore going to look a little bit different. So I'm going to bring up my very poorly drawn diagram. Here, can I zoom out? Tiny bit? Okay. Here we have the common plot structure. So when, I'm going to move my mic, so sorry for the noise there. But when we have the common plot structure, typically we have a narrative Typically we have a narrative exposition. That is the description of kind of setting of the scene and giving you kind of some context for the story. Okay. Then you have what's called an inciting incident. This is something that kicks off the action of the story. You have, I'll mark it with an I. There we go. Then you have the rising action. You have the climax or turning point. You have the falling action. And then you have a resolution, or sometimes called a denouement. Okay. To distinguish it from the other R. So the rising action basically builds up tension, and then the climax is sometimes the highest point of tension in a story and sometimes called the turning point. Then you have typically falling action and then a resolution. I'm not going to say that these stories don't have these elements, because many of them do. You have some exposition to give you context for the story, then something happens, there is tension, there's a turning point, and with many of them you have then the diminishment of that tension and then a resolution. So how things worked out in the end, right? For all of the women telling these stories, they either did okay or they did really well afterwards, even though some of the content can be a bit heavier. But within these plot arcs, you also have what are known as character arcs and some pretty typical journeys that characters go on as they're going through these stories. So, for example, you have someone who kind of starts at a high point, and through a series of misadventures or misfortunes, they are brought to a low point, and then they kind of have to work their way back up to come kind of to where they were when they started. A good example of this, though we're not reading one, would be a number of memoirs that feature addiction or an eating disorder, that the person is kind of doing okay in the beginning. They fall into, let's say, this addiction. They're brought to their lowest point, and then they have to kind of bring their way out of that pit and heal and come back to kind of that high point that they were at, right? That would be a pretty typical character arc. So character arc means you're following the character through the story. Where do they start? Where do they go? Where do they end? Not just what action is happening. Another character arc is that the person starts at a low point and then moves up to a high point. So many celebrity memoirs start off like this. People who were born in less fortunate circumstances, who really had to work hard to bring themselves out of that, and then who come to this place of prominence at the end of the story. Then we have something like this, where we start at a low point, we work our way up, we have, I'm going to call this kind of a midpoint, then something happens. The person is brought to, we'll mark this with a VL, very low, and then they have to really work their way out, and hopefully they come to a better place. So let's combine the two arcs that I just talked about. You have a celebrity story, but also that person gets involved with drugs. If you read any book about any rock star, this is what you're going to find. Oh, a good example would be that movie about Elton John. So he starts low, he kind of rises to prominence, he gets involved with drug use and excess and overspending, and there are he's brought basically to this very low point, and then he kind of has to work his way out of that, and he becomes even more famous and also has a better understanding of himself and is able to like find love and all of those kind of things. So those are some of the typical plot arcs that, or the character arcs rather, that we're going to see. Someone who starts okay and goes low and then comes back up to a higher point. Someone who just starts low and then things get better from there, maybe very slowly but surely. Someone who starts low and seems to do better and then is kind of brought down again, possibly even to a worse place, at least emotionally, than they were before, and then they have to kind of work their way up from there. So those are some of the kind of common plot structures that I would like you to look at. Then we come to common themes, which I kind of hid because I didn't want people reading ahead. Some common themes in women's memoir. I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, but I'll hit on a couple. So gender roles, sex, and sexuality kind of go together. As I mentioned, with the quote from Helen Buss, a lot of these women are writing to kind of repossess their stories and reclaim their place in history. So gender roles have a big play a big part in that, play a big role. And so does sex and sexuality. So those are some of the things a couple of things I'd like you to look for. What are the traditional gender roles? Are these women kind of stuck in traditional gender roles, or have they been assigned to traditional gender roles? Are they trying to break free from those roles? What role does sex play? One of our books has quite a bit of sex in it, and we'll get into that with that particular book. But for a lot of women, because of the prominence that is placed, or the importance that's placed on traditional gender roles, they sometimes can struggle with reclaiming their sexuality. Education is going to be another prominent theme that we're going to talk about in a number of books. Women who are not really allowed or given a proper education, or women who really want a good education and kind of have to fight for it. And there's also, in addition to traditional school education, the idea of moral education. So how are people instilling values in these women when they're children, and what kind of things are they seeing? Mental health, particularly with Susanna Kayson's book, which takes place for the most part in a psychiatric ward. Mental health is another reason I think that a lot of memoirs came out in the 1990s and early 2000s. We have a better discussion at that point about mental health, and a lot of these books try to kind of destigmatize mental health. Besides just the protagonist's mental health, though, we're going to see a number of parental figures who struggle with mental health problems, and how those problems, when left untreated, affect their children. So that's something to look for as well. Triumph over adversity, I mentioned before, overcoming obstacles is going to play a huge part in these books. Coming of age and also other life transitions. So how do what happens to these women as they are coming of age, that point in adolescence where you're forming your identity and you're figuring out who you are and what kind of an adult you want to be. A lot of times that process is kind of interrupted or warped for a lot of the people whose stories we're going to read, and they kind of have to rely on sometimes themselves and sometimes others to overcome those things and to later on in life come to a better understanding of self because that process has been interrupted. We talked already about historical events from a personal perspective. Kind of going along with that is the idea of choice versus fate. Family, early childhood experiences, and trauma. Trauma is not always connected to family or early childhood experiences. I just kind of just highlighted both there. Many of the books that we're reading depict a woman in her teenage years and then early 20s, so going through that process of coming of age, as I mentioned. So what role, if any, does family play in that? What are sometimes, although not autobiographies where they're telling the entire story, but many times they will have a couple chapters or at least later on flashbacks, things like that, to some of their early childhood memories and experiences, showing how those experiences shaped them and brought them into where they are at the core of the book. Oppression. Sometimes that is tied to gender roles and sometimes not. Persistence and courage in overcoming that oppression and in coming through some of the traumatic experiences that they face in life. With that trauma, I did not put this, but also we have some themes of violence and how women are sometimes caught in a cycle of violence, and again, the connection to trauma and oppression, as well as persistence and courage. Values, ethics, and morals, expanding horizons, and being true to yourself and finding yourself. Eventually, even though some of the books have some darker themes of trauma and violence and oppression, and sometimes even those historical events that I mentioned, I think that ultimately memoirs, at least the one that we are reading, but many memoirs end on a positive note. So here are all the things that I went through, but here's where I am now. You saw with our character arcs, although fictional books end on a low point, memoirs do not. The person would likely not be rewriting them if they were still in that valley or being oppressed or trying to overcome their traumatic past. Now, sometimes you can tell that they're kind of writing this to help themselves kind of work through those things and kind of psychologically understand and comprehend what happened to them. But they do, for the most part, end on a positive note. So those are some of the things that I would like for you to think about as you're reading, and also some of the things that we are going to talk about. Do these stories seem truthful to us? Do we question, as sometimes happens, the women who are trying to tell their stories and express their experiences? How are they character driven? What arcs do these women go through as they're narrating their experiences to us? I didn't talk about style, but each person kind of has their own individual style and their own individual voice. And within the common plot structure, and some of the common themes that we're going to see crop up over and over in these stories, we're also going to get to know the women on a very personal level, because I didn't put this in here, but I should have. I think that one of the major themes is vulnerability and telling the story in a really raw, vulnerable way and putting on the page for us readers what they have been through and what they have overcome, and how they were able to triumph or come to a better place. But reliving that childhood trauma and those experiences can be quite difficult. And seeing the life transitions that they go through and the personal journeys, the emotional journey and psychological journey, as well as just, here's what happened. And hopefully by the end, as we see here, hopefully you can use your reading experiences to help you understand your own life maybe a little bit better, and kind of think about your significance and where you fit into the grand scheme of things, and how you are part of history just as these women were. So those are all the things that I hope that you get out of this class, and I can't wait to see what you have to say and interact with you in our forums. Thanks, everybody.